At the heart of this concert is a spectacularly big concert piece, Saint-Saëns Organ Symphony, that uses just about all the resources of the Philharmonic Hall. But before that, two interestingly contrasted Russian pieces. First of all, there's a ballet by Stravinsky called Jeu de cartes, Game of Cards. It specifically is a ballet about a game of poker that's actually played on the stage with the dancers representing the cards. Stravinsky was in what was called his neoclassical phase here, which means he turned his back on all that convulsive violence of the Rite of Spring and all that heavily Russian-flavored exoticism of works like The Firebird and Petrushka. But although he'd looked back towards the music of the classical period, there are elements of Mozart in this music, and those of you who know Rossini's overture, The Thieving Magpie, will recognize a little funny reference to that. What Stravinsky does with this is very strange. He reinvents the sound of classicism in a completely new way, so that it sounds sort of ancient and modern all at the same time. It's completely disconcerting. It's also great fun. You can just imagine the faces of the poker players as they try to keep a straight face one moment and then suddenly a big smile of triumph as they throw down their hand or whatever else. It's all going on in the music, and it's a great piece from that point of view. I'm surprised it's not better known because it's just such great fun. The contrast with Tchaikovsky's Violin Concerto is quite extreme. No, actually, it's not that extreme in the sense that the Tchaikovsky is also a very sunny work. But where Stravinsky was always very guarded about showing his emotions, he was never happier, you might say, than when he was wearing masks, imitating somebody else's style. Tchaikovsky is one of the most open-hearted composers who ever existed. You know, he could just throw his heart into a tune, and what wonderful tunes. Was there ever a greater composer of melodies than Tchaikovsky? And the Violin Concerto is absolutely full of them. But it's very interesting that it should be such a sunny piece, because in 1878, the year Tchaikovsky wrote it, he was recovering from what was probably the biggest crisis of his life, and Tchaikovsky knew a lot about crises. Tchaikovsky was almost certainly gay. Now, there wasn't the stigma, interestingly enough, in Russia in the 19th century about homosexuality that there is today. It just goes to show how things can change. In fact, England was far less tolerant of homosexuality than Russia in the 19th century. Strange how it's actually swapped round there, isn't it? But all the same, Tchaikovsky was very concerned about his reputation. And in a rather weird act of desperation, he married one of his students, a young woman who was clearly in love with him. Tchaikovsky wanted this, obviously, to be a kind of camouflage marriage, what they call a lavender marriage these days. But she got the wrong end of the stick and tried to, well, shall we say, act out the marriage vows in full. Tchaikovsky ran away in terror and made an attempt to drown himself, which failed, and then just disappeared, having had a colossal mental breakdown. And it was while he was away from Russia on a very long, extended, you might say, rest cure holiday, that the idea came to him for the Violin Concerto. He'd been visited by a rather handsome young violinist called Pavel Kotek, who really clearly was partly the inspiration for the concerto too. But, well, out of it comes one of the most exciting, colorful, intensely lyrical, generous, joyful concertos in the violin repertory. And the last movement is just, well, it's a marvelous celebration of all things that you might associate with wild Russian dancing. As one critic put it, you can almost smell the leather boots and the vodka. It has that kind of quality to it, and it's absolutely brilliant writing for the violin. Tchaikovsky wasn't a violinist. How did he understand the capability of the violin so well? Well, he did. And that's one of the reasons why violinists all over the world love this concerto. Then finally, Saint-Saëns' spectacular organ symphony, which was written in 1886, a little later than the Tchaikovsky Violin Concerto. Interestingly enough, Tchaikovsky and Saint-Saëns met and got on rather well. In fact, they ended up dancing together, which is rather funny. But Saint-Saëns really, well, he'd written two symphonies already, but he wasn't happy with them. And interestingly enough, you hardly ever hear them in the concert hall. But this is his third symphony. He decided he was going to try something quite different. Not a symphony, you might say, in imitation of the great German symphonists like Beethoven and Brahms, but something spectacular and on its own. No one had used an organ in a symphony before. Saint-Saëns himself was a very fine organist, so there's an element of something personal there as well. He was also an outstanding pianist, and very, very unusually for its time as well, Saint-Saëns includes a piano. In fact, a piano four-hand piano, a piano duet in this symphony. You start to hear it in the second part of the symphony. There are two parts. A fast first movement after a slow introduction, then an exquisitely beautiful slow movement in which we hear the organ playing mostly very quietly. The organ just plays the chords in the background while the strings pour out a melody that, well, I think Tchaikovsky himself would have been proud of. Then another fast movement, and then we hear the piano runs and flourishes all over the place. And then that finale, in comes the organ, crashing in with a big grand chord of C major. Only when you heard it played on the organ, I can tell you it's much more impressive than that. Meanwhile, the pianists are playing rippling chords of C major all over the place. It's an incredible effect. I mean, there's just something about hearing that organ for the first time come in thunderously with the simplest chord in the whole music business, C major. But there it is. It's almost like an elemental rediscovery. Vaughan Williams once said of the composer Sibelius that he had the ability to make the simple chord of C major sound like a completely dazzling new discovery. Well, Saint-Saëns does exactly the same in this organ symphony. Tremendous build up to the end with a big orchestra, the pianos and the organ all together. It's, well, it's almost, if you can imagine it, like Phil Spector's Wall of Sound, only almost a century before he actually invented it. It just goes to show that some ideas in music never change. The idea of just wallowing in sheer richness and depth and power of sound is something that's been around for a very long time. And Saint-Saëns Organ Symphony, well, it may end with that, but on the way there, as I said, there are all sorts of fascinating, colourful, wonderfully tuneful moments, and that gorgeous slow movement, which I must say, for me, is actually my favourite bit of the symphony. So if you're hearing it for the first time, I think you're in for a bit of a treat.